The most dangerous people are usually the ones who never need to prove they are dangerous. The lunch bell echoed through Blackwood State Prison like a warning siren, and within seconds the narrow hallways filled with the heavy sound of boots and quiet conversations. Every new inmate learned the same lesson on the first day. The cafeteria was not just a place to eat. It was where the rules of the prison were written without paper, without judges, and without mercy. If you looked weak, someone would test you. If you looked afraid, someone would own you. And if you made the wrong enemy, the rest of your sentence could become a nightmare. Elijah Carter walked through those steel doors carrying nothing except his meal tray and a small canvas bag with his personal belongings. He was a black man in his late 50s, his hair touched with gray, his shoulders relaxed, and his eyes calm in a way that did not seem to belong inside a maximum security prison. The orange uniform hung loosely on his lean frame. He did not walk like someone trying to impress anyone. He did not look around to measure the other inmates. He simply followed the correctional officer to the serving line, thanked the kitchen worker who handed him his food, and slowly made his way toward an empty table near the back wall. Around him, conversations faded. Blackwood had a king, and everyone knew his name. Derek Malone was not the biggest inmate inside the prison, but he was the one who controlled the largest group. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always surrounded by loyal followers, he treated the cafeteria like it belonged to him. New arrivals usually introduced themselves without being asked because they understood that refusing was not an option. Derek noticed Elijah immediately. The old man did not look nervous. He did not lower his eyes. He did not rush. He simply walked as if the noise around him did not exist. One of Derek's friends leaned closer and laughed. "Look at that old guy. He acts like he owns the place." Another inmate shook his head. "He will learn." Elijah reached the empty table and carefully placed down his tray. A bowl of soup, a piece of bread, and a small cup of water. Nothing special. He pulled out the chair and sat down. For a moment, the room seemed perfectly ordinary. Then Derek stood up. The entire section became quiet. Even inmates who hated him knew better than to speak when he decided to make an example out of someone. Derek walked across the cafeteria with a slow smile, followed by 4 members of his group. A correctional officer glanced over, but quickly looked away. Blackwood had its own balance, and most people preferred not to interfere unless absolutely necessary. Derek stopped beside Elijah's table. The old man looked up politely. "Can I help you?" he asked in a soft voice. The question made several inmates laugh. Derek picked up Elijah's bowl of soup and held it in the air. "You are sitting in my spot," he said. Elijah looked around the nearly empty cafeteria. "There are many open tables," he answered calmly. The smile disappeared from Derek's face. "I said you were sitting in my spot." Elijah slowly stood up. Not because he looked frightened. Not because he was giving in. He simply stood, picked up his cup of water, and took one quiet step backward. Several inmates exchanged confused looks. Most people begged. Some argued. Others tried to act tough. This old man did none of those things. Derek laughed loudly and looked back at the crowd. "See this? He already knows who runs this place." Then, without another word, he threw the bowl forward. Warm soup splashed across Elijah's uniform and dripped onto the concrete floor. A roar of laughter exploded through the cafeteria. A few inmates slapped the tables. Others pointed. Derek stepped closer, expecting anger, fear, or at least an insult. Instead, Elijah looked down at the stain on his shirt. He reached into his pocket, removed a folded handkerchief, and quietly wiped his hands. The laughter slowly faded. Derek frowned. "Did you hear me, old man?" Elijah raised his eyes. There was no anger in them. No panic. No hatred. Only a strange kind of peace that made the entire moment feel wrong. One inmate sitting near the wall stopped smiling. His name was Frank Holloway, and he had spent more than 20 years moving from one prison to another. He had seen champions, soldiers, gang leaders, and professional fighters. As he watched Elijah stand there without a single sign of fear, an old memory pushed its way into his mind. It was not the face. It was not the age. It was the posture, the balance, the way the old man placed his feet. Frank whispered to himself so quietly that nobody else could hear. "I know that stance." Derek took another step forward. "You think this is funny?" Elijah folded the handkerchief, slipped it back into his pocket, and calmly looked at the younger man. The entire cafeteria waited for him to speak. And then, In a voice so quiet that everyone had to lean in to hear, Elijah said, "Young man, you still have time to walk away." The cafeteria stayed completely silent after Elijah Carter spoke. Nobody expected those words. Inside Blackwood State Prison, people usually answered humiliation with anger or fear. Some shouted. Some begged. Others tried to prove they were tougher than the person standing in front of them. Elijah did none of those things. He simply stood there with soup dripping from his uniform as though the moment had already passed. Derek Malone looked around at the faces watching him. His followers waited for him to laugh. The rest of the room waited for the old man to break. Derek smiled, but something about that calm expression in front of him made the smile feel forced. "Walk away," he repeated. "You think you are giving me advice?" Elijah slowly picked up his tray from the table. "I think every man gets a chance to make a better choice." A few inmates laughed again, but the sound was weaker this time. Derek stepped closer until only a few inches separated them. "You do not know where you are." Elijah looked directly into his eyes. "I know exactly where I am." The answer was quiet, but it carried through the entire cafeteria. Frank Holloway sat frozen in his chair. The old memory inside his head refused to disappear. Years ago, he had worked maintenance during a regional martial arts tournament before his own life had fallen apart. He remembered watching competitors bow before stepping onto the mat. He remembered one instructor standing perfectly still while everyone around him moved with nervous energy. The posture had been exactly the same. Balanced, relaxed, patient. Frank stared at Elijah's feet. The old man was standing naturally, but somehow every movement looked controlled. Derek shook his head and reached for Elijah's tray. He pushed it off the table, sending the bread and empty bowl onto the floor. "Pick it up," he said. Elijah glanced down for only a second. Then he bent over, collected the tray, and placed it back on the table. He even picked up the bread and brushed away the dust before setting it beside the bowl. Nobody understood what they were watching. One of Derek's own friends whispered, "Why is he acting like this?" Another inmate answered quietly, "Maybe he is scared." Frank slowly shook his head. "No," he whispered to himself. "That is not fear." A correctional officer walked toward the group, looked at the spilled soup on the floor, and sighed. "Break it up," he said. Derek raised both hands with a grin. "We are just talking." The officer looked at Elijah. "You got a problem?" Elijah answered politely, "No, sir." The officer nodded once and walked away. As soon as he disappeared through the side door, Derek laughed loudly. "You had your chance." Elijah looked at the empty bowl. "So did you." The strange answer made several inmates stop smiling. Derek had embarrassed hundreds of people over the years, and almost all of them reacted the same way. This old prisoner was different. It was almost as if nothing happening around him could disturb his peace. Derek leaned closer. "You think you are better than everyone here?" Elijah gently folded his handkerchief and placed it back into his pocket. "No. I think every person here has the chance to become better than they were yesterday." Frank felt a chill run through him. He had heard words like that before. Not in prison. Not from criminals. From teachers. From coaches. From men who spent their lives building others instead of tearing them down. Derek finally stepped back and looked around the cafeteria. "This old man talks too much," he said. His group laughed, but even they sounded uncertain now. Elijah picked up his tray and turned toward another empty table near the far wall. He sat down, broke the piece of bread in half, and quietly began eating what little food remained. The entire cafeteria kept watching him. No anger, no complaints, no threats, just silence. Frank could not take his eyes off the old prisoner. The more he watched, the stronger the memory became. Somewhere in his past he had seen that calm face, that balanced posture, and those patient eyes before. He just could not remember where. And for the first time in many years, Frank Holloway felt that Blackwood Prison had just welcomed someone very different from every other inmate who had ever walked through its gates. That night, long after the cafeteria had emptied, the strange silence around Elijah Carter refused to disappear. Inside Blackwood State Prison, stories traveled faster than official reports. By the time the evening count was finished, almost every inmate had heard about the old man who had soup thrown on him and never raised his voice. Most people laughed about it. A few thought he was simply afraid. But there were others who could not stop thinking about the way he had stood there without moving. Frank Holloway was one of them. He lay awake on the narrow bunk in his cell, staring at the ceiling while an old memory kept returning. He had spent more than 20 years inside different correctional facilities, and before that he had worked dozens of temporary jobs. One summer, many years ago, he had been hired to help set up equipment for a large martial arts tournament in Chicago. He remembered banners hanging from the walls, rows of polished trophies, and hundreds of competitors dressed in white uniforms. Most of all, he remembered one instructor who never seemed nervous while everyone else was. The man had stood quietly with his hands behind his back, watching his students with calm eyes. Frank could not remember the face anymore. Time had erased that. But he remembered the posture perfectly. Elijah Carter had stood exactly the same way. Across the housing block, Derek Malone sat with the men who followed him. They were laughing about what had happened in the cafeteria. One of them said, "That old guy looked ready to cry." Another shook his head. No, something about him felt strange. Derek leaned back against the wall. "He is just another new inmate. Tomorrow he will understand how things work around here." The others nodded, but nobody sounded completely convinced. Earlier that day, they had expected Elijah to argue or lose his temper. Instead, he had simply cleaned his hands and spoken as though nothing important had happened. Derek had won the moment, but somehow it did not feel like a victory. The next morning, the prison yard opened after breakfast. Groups gathered in their usual places. Some played cards. Others walked slow circles around the track. Elijah sat alone on a wooden bench near the fence with a small library book resting in his hands. He turned each page carefully, completely ignoring the noise around him. Frank noticed him immediately. He walked past twice before finally sitting down at the opposite end of the bench. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Frank looked at the book. "You like history?" Elijah smiled softly. "History helps people remember that nothing lasts forever." Frank nodded. "Even prison?" Elijah closed the book. "Especially prison." The answer surprised him. Most inmates talked about surviving their sentence. Very few talked about life after it. Frank looked at Elijah's hands. They were steady. The fingers showed age, but they carried almost no signs of nervous movement. "Have we met before?" Frank asked quietly. Elijah thought for a moment. "I do not believe so." Frank frowned. "You remind me of someone." Elijah looked toward the fence where the morning sunlight touched the concrete. Sometimes people see what they need to remember. Before Frank could ask another question, the recreation whistle sounded. Elijah stood up from the bench. As he did, a small rubber ball rolled across the yard from a game nearby. The ball bounced once toward his feet. Without looking down, Elijah reached out and caught it cleanly with one hand before it touched the ground a second time. The movement was so natural that he almost seemed unaware he had done it. He handed the ball back to a younger inmate with a friendly smile and continued walking toward the library building. Frank remained frozen on the bench. It had happened in less than a second. No wasted motion. No sudden reach. Just perfect timing. A memory flashed through his mind. Competitors standing in long lines. An instructor demonstrating balance and control. A crowd applauding after a simple movement that looked almost effortless. Frank slowly stood up. "No," he whispered to himself. "It cannot be." Across the yard, Derek had also seen the catch. One of his friends laughed. Lucky reflexes. Derek crossed his arms and kept watching Elijah disappear through the library doors. For reasons he could not explain, the old man no longer looked weak. He looked like someone carrying a secret, and somewhere deep inside, Derek began to wonder if he had made a mistake the moment he picked up that bowl of soup. Blackwood State Prison had a strange way of turning small moments into legends. By the afternoon after the incident in the cafeteria, almost everyone had their own version of the story. Some said the old inmate had been too frightened to react. Others claimed he had simply accepted his place. But the people who had actually been there remembered something different. They remembered the silence. They remembered the way Elijah Carter had looked at Derek Malone without anger or fear. Most of all, they remembered the strange warning that still echoed in their minds. "Young man, you still have time to walk away." Frank Holloway could not stop thinking about those words. During his years inside prison, he had met men who pretended to be fearless, but they usually spoke loudly and tried to convince everyone around them. Elijah was the opposite. The old man spoke quietly, and somehow that made people listen even more. After breakfast, Frank walked toward the small library building at the edge of the recreation yard. It was one of the few peaceful places left inside Blackwood. A volunteer librarian named Mrs. Eleanor Brooks organized the shelves and often allowed inmates to spend extra time reading if they behaved themselves. As Frank stepped inside, he immediately saw Elijah sitting alone at a wooden table with 3 books stacked neatly beside him. Mrs. Brooks smiled at the old inmate. "You finished another one already?" Elijah carefully closed the book in front of him. "A good story deserves full attention." She laughed softly. "Most people here only want something to pass the time." Elijah looked around the quiet room. Sometimes time is exactly what people need. Frank stayed near one of the shelves, pretending to look through old novels while secretly watching the conversation. Everything about Elijah seemed ordinary. His movements were calm. His voice was gentle. He even helped an older inmate reach a book from the top shelf without making a big show of it. Yet Frank could not shake the feeling that he had seen those movements before. Across the prison yard, Derek Malone sat with his group under a metal awning. One of his friends pointed toward the library. "There he is." Derek looked up. Through the window, he could barely see Elijah placing books back on the shelves. "Still acting like he belongs somewhere else," one inmate muttered. Derek frowned. "Tomorrow he will stop." The others nodded, but nobody sounded certain anymore. The old man had become a mystery, and mysteries made people uncomfortable. Inside the library, Mrs. Brooks wheeled out a small cart filled with damaged books that needed repair. Elijah immediately stood up. "May I help?" he asked. She handed him a roll of clear tape and smiled. "If you do not mind." Frank watched as Elijah carefully repaired the torn corners one by one. His hands moved slowly, but every motion was exact. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was wasted. It reminded Frank of a craftsman working on something valuable. Suddenly, one of the books slipped from the cart. Before it could hit the floor, Elijah reached out and caught it without even looking away from the page he had been reading. The movement lasted less than a second. Mrs. Brooks blinked. That was quick. Elijah simply smiled and placed the book back on the cart. Frank felt his heart beating faster. He had seen the same effortless control twice now. The ball in the yard, the falling book. Neither looked like luck. As the afternoon ended, inmates began leaving the library. Frank waited near the door until Elijah walked outside, carrying 2 borrowed books. "Mind if I ask you something?" Frank said. Elijah stopped and nodded politely. "Of course." Frank studied his face. "Did you ever teach?" Elijah looked toward the prison yard where the evening sunlight stretched across the concrete. A faint smile appeared. "A long time ago, I helped some people discover what they were capable of." Frank swallowed slowly. "Sports." Elijah adjusted the books in his hands. "Life." Then he continued walking toward the housing block. Frank stood completely still. He watched the old man disappear into the crowd, and suddenly another memory returned. A large arena, hundreds of spectators. A master instructor speaking to his students before a championship match. Frank could not hear the exact words anymore, but he remembered the feeling. Quiet confidence. Perfect discipline. As the evening count bell echoed across Blackwood, Frank realized he was no longer trying to figure out whether Elijah Carter had once been someone important. He was trying to remember where the entire world had already seen him before. The mystery surrounding Elijah Carter only grew stronger over the next few days. Blackwood State Prison was a place where people usually learned everything about a new inmate within hours. Someone always knew an old friend, an old enemy, or a piece of a forgotten story. Yet nobody seemed to know anything about the quiet man who spent his free time repairing books and reading in the library. The prison records only said he had arrived from another state facility. They did not explain why a man in his late 50s carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had already faced much harder things than prison walls. Derek Malone hated not knowing. Sitting with his group in the recreation yard, he watched Elijah walk slowly along the track with a book under one arm. "Find out who he is," Derek said to one of his followers. "Everybody has a story." The younger inmate nodded and disappeared toward the housing block. Derek leaned back against the bench, pretending not to care, but the image of the old man quietly wiping soup from his shirt kept returning to him. He had embarrassed hundreds of people during his years inside Blackwood. Some had shouted. Some had cried. Others had tried to challenge him. Elijah had simply looked at him with pity. That bothered Derek more than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Frank Holloway could not let go of the memory growing inside his mind. During his afternoon work assignment, he cleaned an old storage room beside the prison gymnasium. Dust covered everything. Broken chairs, empty boxes, and stacks of forgotten magazines filled the shelves. While moving a carton of old sports publications, one worn magazine slipped onto the floor. The cover was faded almost beyond recognition, but one headline was still visible: National Martial Arts Championship. Frank bent down and picked it up. Most of the pages were damaged, but as he slowly turned them, one photograph caught his attention. It showed a line of young competitors standing beside an older instructor dressed in a simple uniform. The picture was grainy, and the faces were difficult to see, but Frank felt his heart begin to race. The man standing in the center held the same relaxed posture, the same calm expression, the same quiet confidence. Frank looked closer, but part of the page had been torn away. The instructor's name was missing. A correctional officer called out from the hallway. "You finished in there?" Frank quickly folded the magazine and placed it under the supply box. "Almost," he answered. For the rest of the day, he could think about nothing else. That evening, Elijah returned to the library. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks was organizing donated books when she noticed him carrying a damaged dictionary. "That one is falling apart," she said. Elijah smiled. "Then maybe it deserves a little patience." She handed him a small repair kit, and together they sat at the table fixing old pages. Another inmate accidentally knocked a pencil from the edge of the desk. Before anyone reacted, Elijah reached out and caught it in midair between two fingers. The movement was so smooth that Mrs. Brooks simply blinked and smiled. "You have quick hands." Elijah carefully handed the pencil back. "Years of practice." "Practice doing what?" she asked with a laugh. Elijah looked at the old dictionary for a moment. "Learning not to waste motion." Across the room, Frank had just entered through the library door. He heard those words and stopped walking. Learning not to waste motion. Something inside his memory finally shifted. He remembered the old tournament. He remembered competitors repeating the same techniques thousands of times. He remembered one instructor telling a reporter that true mastery came from removing every unnecessary movement. Frank stared at Elijah from across the room. The old prisoner quietly repaired another page as though nothing had happened. Frank slowly reached into his pocket and unfolded the small piece of the magazine page he had managed to save. The picture was blurry, but the posture was unmistakable. He looked from the paper to Elijah and back again. The answer was still incomplete, but for the first time he believed he was not chasing a coincidence. Somewhere outside Blackwood, before prison walls and locked gates, Elijah Carter had been a man the world once recognized, and Frank had a feeling that Derek Malone was getting closer and closer to making the biggest mistake of his life. By the end of the week, Elijah Carter had become the quiet mystery everyone inside Blackwood State Prison was talking about. The strange part was not that he kept to himself. Many inmates did that. The strange part was that the prison itself seemed unable to change him. The loud voices in the cafeteria did not bother him. The endless noise of metal doors and shouting guards never disturbed him. Even Derek Malone and his group could not seem to pull any anger from the old man. Every morning Elijah followed the same routine. He woke before the first count, folded his blanket neatly, made his bed with careful precision, and spent a few quiet minutes sitting with his eyes closed before the lights came on. His cellmate, an older inmate named Walter Briggs, had watched this routine for several days without saying anything. Finally he asked, "Do you pray every morning?" Elijah opened his eyes and smiled. "Sometimes I think. Sometimes I remember. Sometimes I simply breathe." Walter laughed softly. "That sounds harder than prayer." Elijah stood and straightened the corner of his blanket. "Most important things are." Walter had shared cells with dozens of men over the years. Some talked in their sleep. Some argued with themselves. Others paced the floor all night. Elijah was different. Nothing seemed to shake him. Even the first morning after the soup incident, he had quietly cleaned his uniform and thanked the laundry worker for helping him. Walter could not understand it. "Does nothing make you angry?" he asked. Elijah looked toward the small window in the cell. "Anger is easy. Discipline takes practice." Across the prison yard, Derek Malone was becoming more frustrated every day. The old man had not complained. He had not tried to gain sympathy from anyone. In fact, he acted as though Derek barely existed. That made the gang leader feel invisible, and inside Blackwood, nothing was more dangerous to a man's pride than being ignored. One of Derek's followers walked over carrying a folded piece of paper. "We asked around," he said. "Nobody knows much about him. Just that he came from another prison in Colorado." Derek unfolded the paper. A few lines of transfer information had been copied from a work assignment office. Name, age, previous facility. Nothing else. There has to be more, Derek muttered. The younger inmate shrugged. Maybe he really is just an old man. Derek looked toward the library building where Elijah was helping Mrs. Eleanor Brooks carry a stack of books inside. No, he said quietly. There is something wrong with that picture. Inside the library, Frank Holloway was searching through another box of old magazines that Mrs. Brooks had saved for recycling. He had not told anyone about the torn championship photograph. Part of him was afraid he was imagining the connection. He carefully opened another sports magazine and began flipping through faded pages. Boxing, wrestling, college football. Then suddenly he stopped. An article about martial arts schools across America filled 2 pages. Most of the pictures were too small to recognize, but one headline caught his eye. Grandmaster leads youth program to national success. The photograph had been damaged by water, and the man's face was almost completely blurred. Only the posture remained clear. Frank slowly sat down. The figure stood with hands behind his back, shoulders relaxed, and feet balanced exactly the way Elijah stood every day. Mrs. Brooks noticed him staring at the page. Find something interesting? She asked. Frank quickly closed the magazine. Maybe. At that moment, Elijah walked over carrying another stack of books. One volume slipped from the top and started falling toward the floor. Before Frank or Mrs. Brooks could react, Elijah gently turned and caught it against his arm without even looking directly at it. He placed the book back on the stack and continued walking. Mrs. Brooks smiled. You always seem to know where things are. Elijah looked down at the old books. If you pay attention, most things tell you where they are about to go. Frank felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. That was not luck. It was years of training, years of discipline, years of repeating the same movements until they became part of who a person was. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the library floor, Frank unfolded the damaged magazine page one more time and placed it beside the newer article. The faces were impossible to identify, but the posture was identical. He looked up at Elijah, who was quietly repairing another torn book cover, and for the first time he allowed himself to believe the impossible. Somewhere beyond these prison walls, before the gray hair and the orange uniform, Elijah Carter had not simply studied martial arts. He had spent a lifetime mastering them. The quiet routine inside Blackwood State Prison continued, but the atmosphere around Elijah Carter had changed in ways nobody could explain. The old inmate still spent his mornings in the library and his afternoons walking slow circles around the recreation yard, yet more and more eyes followed him wherever he went. Some inmates believed he had once been a famous athlete. Others guessed he had served in the military. A few thought he was simply an old man with unusual luck. Elijah never corrected anyone. If someone spoke to him, he answered politely. If someone asked about his past, he simply smiled and changed the subject. Frank Holloway had reached the point where he could not ignore the questions any longer. The damaged magazine page remained folded inside his pocket, and every time he looked at it, another memory surfaced. One afternoon, while helping Mrs. Eleanor Brooks organize donations in the library storage room, he found an old cardboard box filled with newspaper clippings that local volunteers had used for art projects years before. Most of them were ordinary sports articles, but one yellowed page caught his attention. Across the top, faded letters still remained. National Taekwondo exhibition draws record crowd. Frank carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The picture was old and blurred, but he could make out a group of students standing around an older instructor dressed in a traditional uniform. The article itself was damaged, and much of the text had disappeared, but one sentence could still be read. The Grandmaster reminded his students that discipline was more important than victory. Frank felt his hands begin to shake. He had heard almost those exact words from Elijah only a few days earlier. Anger is easy. Discipline takes practice. Mrs. Brooks looked over from another shelf. Find something useful? She asked. Frank folded the clipping and slipped it into his pocket. Maybe more than useful. Across the yard, Derek Malone was growing tired of hearing people talk about the old inmate. One of his own friends had started spending afternoons in the library instead of sitting with the group. You are reading books now? Derek asked with a laugh. The younger inmate shrugged. It is quiet in there. Derek frowned. Since when do you care about quiet? The inmate looked toward the library windows. Since I realized that old guy never lets anything bother him. Derek looked away without answering. Deep down, he hated admitting it, but he had been watching Elijah too. Every day the old prisoner followed the same routine. He helped carry books. He cleaned tables. He spoke kindly to people who had nothing to offer him. Derek had tried to convince himself that it was all an act, but the act never ended. That afternoon, Elijah sat outside the library helping an elderly inmate repair a broken pair of reading glasses. The small screw slipped from the frame and fell toward the ground. Before anyone else even noticed, Elijah reached out and caught it between his fingers. The older inmate laughed in surprise. "You have better eyes than I do." Elijah smiled. "Sometimes you only need to pay attention." Frank happened to be walking across the yard when he saw the movement. He stopped immediately. That was the third time. The ball, the falling book, now the tiny screw. None of them had looked forced. None of them had looked like tricks. They looked like habits built over decades. Later that evening, Frank sat alone in his cell with the newspaper clipping, the torn magazine page, and the memory that refused to leave him. Suddenly, another image appeared in his mind. The old tournament arena. Hundreds of people watching in complete silence. The instructor standing before a line of students. One reporter asking him what made a true master different from everyone else. Frank could almost hear the answer. A true master does not react because he already understands what comes next. Frank slowly stood up from his bunk. His heart was beating faster than it had in years. The old prisoner who had quietly cleaned soup from his shirt was not simply a disciplined man. He was someone who had spent an entire lifetime training his body and mind to move with perfect control. Frank looked through the bars of his cell toward the dark hallway outside and whispered the thought that had been building inside him since the first day they met. Elijah Carter was not hiding because he was weak. He was hiding because the world outside these walls had once known exactly who he was. The rumors inside Blackwood State Prison had reached a point where nobody knew what to believe anymore. Some inmates claimed Elijah Carter had once trained soldiers. Others insisted he had been a famous coach. A few even joked that he had probably invented martial arts himself. Elijah never answered any of those stories. Every morning, he still walked to the library, returned borrowed books, helped Mrs. Eleanor Brooks repair old volumes, and treated every person with the same quiet respect. The more people watched him, the less they understood him. Derek Malone had finally reached his limit. Sitting with his group after breakfast, he noticed that several inmates who usually gathered around him were watching Elijah instead. The old prisoner was helping Walter Briggs carry a heavy box of donated books across the yard. "Look at that," one of Derek's followers muttered. "Everybody acts like he is some kind of hero." Derek stood up. Then maybe he needs another reminder about where he is. The others followed him without hesitation. Across the yard, Frank Holloway saw Derek walking toward the library and immediately felt uneasy. During the past week, he had gathered enough small clues to convince himself that Elijah was hiding an extraordinary past. The old newspaper clipping was folded safely inside his pocket. The damaged magazine page was hidden beneath his mattress. None of it proved anything, but together they painted the picture of a man who had once stood in front of crowds instead of prison walls. Frank quietly put down the box he was carrying and started walking in the same direction. Elijah and Walter had just reached the library steps when Derek blocked their path. Walter lowered his eyes immediately. He knew trouble when he saw it. Elijah simply adjusted the box in his hands. Derek looked at the old prisoner and smiled. "Still carrying books?" Elijah nodded politely. "They are heavy." A few inmates laughed. Derek looked at the box. "Maybe you are too old for this place." Elijah answered calmly. "Everyone grows older. Not everyone grows wiser." The smile disappeared from Derek's face. He reached over and pushed one corner of the box. Several books slipped out and scattered across the concrete. Walter took a nervous step backward. Derek looked around at the gathering crowd. "Looks like you dropped something." Elijah slowly knelt down and began picking up the books one by one. He brushed the dust from each cover before placing it back inside the box. Nobody laughed this time. There was something unsettling about watching a man refuse to become angry. Derek bent down, picked up one of the books, and looked at the title. It was an old biography of a teacher. He shook his head and tossed it gently onto the ground beside Elijah. "Maybe you should read something useful." Elijah looked at the book for a moment before picking it up. "Every story teaches something." Derek folded his arms. "What does that one teach?" Elijah stood with the repaired box in his hands. that the strongest people spend their lives helping others become stronger. The words landed with unexpected weight. Frank stopped several feet away and watched the expression on Derek's face change. For the first time since he had met the old prisoner, the gang leader looked uncertain. One of Derek's followers tried to laugh, but the sound faded quickly. Elijah turned and carried the box into the library as though nothing unusual had happened. Walter hurried after him. Mrs. Brooks looked up from the front desk. "Everything all right?" Elijah placed the books on the table and smiled. A few of them needed to be picked up. Outside, Derek stood silently watching through the library window. One of his friends walked beside him. "Forget about him," the younger inmate said. Derek kept staring at Elijah. "No, why?" Derek looked down at his own hands. "Because I cannot figure him out." Across the room, Frank helped Elijah place the books back onto the shelves. As they worked, one old photograph slipped from inside the pages of the biography and floated toward the floor. Elijah reached out and caught it before it touched the ground. Frank saw the movement clearly. Calm, precise, effortless. Elijah looked at the faded picture for a second before handing it to him. It showed a group of young martial arts students standing beside an instructor, but the image had faded too much to reveal any faces. Frank stared at it anyway. Elijah noticed the look in his eyes and quietly said, "Old memories have a way of finding us when we are ready." Then he returned to placing books on the shelf, leaving Frank to wonder if the old prisoner already knew that his secret was slowly beginning to come back into the light. The following morning, Blackwood State Prison felt different. Nobody said it out loud, but the balance inside the walls had started to shift. For years, Derek Malone had controlled every room he entered simply because people expected him to. Now, for the first time, there was someone who did not seem to notice his presence at all. Elijah Carter walked across the recreation yard carrying 2 library books beneath his arm, greeting Walter Briggs with a simple nod before taking his usual seat near the fence. He opened the first book and began reading as if the rest of the prison did not exist. Derek watched from across the yard. One of his followers noticed his expression. "You are still thinking about that old man?" Derek answered without taking his eyes away. "Nobody ignores me." The younger inmate laughed nervously. "Maybe he is too old to understand." Derek slowly stood up. "Then I will help him understand." Frank Holloway saw Derek moving before anyone else did. He had spent the entire night looking at the old newspaper clipping and the damaged photograph hidden beneath his mattress. The pieces still did not fit perfectly, but one thing had become clear. Elijah was not pretending to be calm. Calm was simply who he was. Frank quickly walked toward the library steps, hoping he could reach the old prisoner first. Elijah turned another page in his book. Without looking up, he quietly said, "Good morning, Frank." Frank stopped in surprise. "How did you know it was me?" Elijah smiled faintly. "You always walk a little slower when you are thinking." Before Frank could answer, a shadow fell across the bench. Derek Malone stood directly in front of them. The entire yard seemed to pause. Conversations faded. Even the correctional officer near the gate glanced over. Derek looked down at the open book. "You really like reading." Elijah carefully closed the cover and placed the book beside him. "There is always something new to learn." Derek crossed his arms. "I think you forgot where you are." Elijah looked around the prison yard. "No, I remember every day." Derek took one step closer. "Then maybe you should remember who runs this place." Frank felt his heart pounding. He wanted to say something, but the words would not come. Elijah slowly stood up from the bench. He did not look angry. He did not even look worried. He simply faced Derek with the same peaceful expression he had worn since the day he arrived. "Power is a strange thing," Elijah said quietly. Derek frowned. "What does that mean?" Elijah looked toward the fence where the morning sun stretched across the concrete. "Many people spend their whole lives trying to prove they have it." Derek laughed loudly. "And what about you?" Elijah looked back at him. "I spent my life learning that I did not need to." The yard became completely silent. Even Derek's own group exchanged uncertain glances. The answer was not what anyone expected. Derek reached down, picked up Elijah's library book, and held it in front of him. Maybe this belongs somewhere else. With a careless motion, he tossed it onto the ground. The book landed in the dirt beside the bench. Walter Briggs lowered his head. Frank closed his eyes for a second, expecting the old man to finally lose his patience. Instead, Elijah calmly bent down, picked up the book, brushed away the dust, and carefully checked the cover for damage. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks had trusted him with the library collection, and that seemed to matter more than anything else. Derek stared at him in disbelief. Are you ever going to get angry? Elijah gently held the book against his chest. Then he looked directly at Derek and spoke so quietly that everyone around them leaned forward to hear. Anger only lasts a moment. The choices we make because of it can last forever. Frank felt another forgotten memory return. He remembered reading an interview years ago with a famous Taekwondo instructor who had been asked why he never argued with people who insulted him. The answer had been almost identical. Frank looked at Elijah, then at the old newspaper clipping folded inside his pocket. Suddenly, he was no longer searching for proof. Deep inside, he already knew the truth. Across the yard, Derek slowly stepped backward, but not because he had changed his mind. He stepped back because he had decided something else. If the old prisoner refused to react with words, then sooner or later he would find another way to force him to reveal whatever secret he had been hiding all along. After the confrontation in the recreation yard, something invisible changed inside Blackwood State Prison. Derek Malone still walked with the same confidence, and his group still followed him, but the certainty that had always surrounded him was beginning to fade. More inmates were watching Elijah Carter than ever before, not because he demanded attention, but because he never seemed to need it. The old prisoner continued living exactly as he had since the day he arrived. He woke before sunrise, straightened his bed, spent a few quiet moments in silence, and then walked to the library with a book under his arm. It was almost as though the walls, the noise, and the endless tension of prison life could not reach him. Frank Holloway had stopped trying to convince himself that it was all coincidence. The newspaper clipping, the old magazine photograph, the stories Elijah told without meaning to tell them, and the perfect control in every movement all pointed toward the same answer. Still, one question remained. If Elijah had once been someone so respected, why was he here now? That afternoon, Frank found him alone in the library repairing the torn binding of an old history book. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks had stepped away to organize donations, leaving the room completely quiet. Frank slowly walked to the table and placed the damaged newspaper clipping beside the book Elijah was repairing. Elijah looked down at it for a moment. His expression did not change. Where did you find that? He asked gently. An old storage room, Frank answered. Elijah carefully touched the edge of the paper. Time has not been kind to it. Frank took a deep breath. Were you ever part of this? Elijah remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he folded the newspaper and handed it back. Many years ago, I knew people who loved teaching. Frank looked at him closely. And were you one of them? A soft smile appeared on Elijah's face. Sometimes the teacher learns more than the students. The answer was not really an answer, but somehow it felt honest. Before Frank could ask another question, the library door opened. Walter Briggs stepped inside looking nervous. Elijah, he said quietly, you should probably stay away from the yard today. Elijah looked up. Why? Walter lowered his voice. Derek has been asking about you all morning. Elijah simply closed the book he had been repairing. Then I hope he finds the answers he is looking for. Outside, Derek sat with his group beneath the metal awning near the basketball court. One of the younger inmates walked over carrying a small folded paper. This came from one of the work offices, he whispered. Derek opened it. The transfer record contained almost nothing. Name, age, previous facility. One additional line caught his attention. Approved participation in rehabilitation education programs. Derek laughed. A teacher. The others smiled. That explains the books. But Derek did not look satisfied. Something about the old man still refused to fit. If Elijah had really spent his life teaching, why did he move with the awareness of someone trained for something far different? Across the yard, Elijah and Frank walked together toward the housing block. As they passed the fence, a basketball rolled loose from a nearby game. It bounced awkwardly across the pavement and headed toward a storm drain. Without breaking his conversation, Elijah gently reached out with one foot and stopped the ball exactly at the edge before it could disappear. He picked it up and handed it back to a younger inmate with a kind smile. Thank you, sir, the young man said. Elijah nodded and continued walking. Frank stared at the spot where the ball had stopped. The movement had looked effortless. Perfect timing. Perfect balance. The younger inmate ran back to his game and laughed with his friends, never realizing what he had just seen. Frank finally understood something important. Elijah never showed off. Every unusual movement happened only because someone else needed help. That evening, after the final count, Frank unfolded the newspaper clipping again beneath the dim light in his cell. He read the fated sentence one more time. The Grandmaster reminded his students that discipline was more important than victory. Then he remembered the words Elijah had spoken in the yard only hours before. Many people spend their whole lives trying to prove they have power. I spent my life learning that I did not need to. Frank slowly looked through the bars toward the dark hallway outside and whispered to himself, "You were not just a teacher." At that exact moment, several cells away, Derek Malone sat awake staring at the ceiling, making a decision that would force the quiet old prisoner to reveal the truth once and for all. The next day arrived with a strange feeling hanging over Blackwood State Prison. Even the correctional officers noticed that the inmates were quieter than usual. Rumors had spread through every housing block. Some believed Derek Malone was planning to embarrass Elijah Carter one final time. Others believed the old prisoner would finally reveal why he seemed so different from everyone else. Elijah himself appeared completely unchanged. After breakfast, he returned a borrowed history book to the library, thanked Mrs. Eleanor Brooks for recommending it, and helped Walter Briggs organize a card of donated books. It was an ordinary morning, and perhaps that was what made it feel so unusual. Frank Holloway stood near the library entrance, watching Elijah with the same questions turning over in his mind. The old newspaper clipping rested safely inside his pocket. He had almost decided to show it to Elijah, but something held him back. Part of him felt that the old man would only smile and tell him that the past was not important. Across the recreation yard, Derek Malone sat with his group, unusually quiet. One of the younger inmates looked at him. "You really think he is hiding something?" Derek never looked away from Elijah. Nobody stays that calm unless they know something everyone else does not. The younger inmate laughed. "Maybe he is just old." Derek slowly stood. "Then let us find out." Several heads turned as Derek walked across the yard. Conversations stopped. Card games ended. Even the basketball rolling across the pavement was forgotten as inmates looked toward the library steps. Frank saw Derek coming and immediately stepped closer to Elijah. "You do not have to do this," Frank whispered. Elijah looked at him with a gentle smile. "Do what?" "Talk to him." Elijah closed the last book on the cart. Sometimes people are looking for answers, even if they do not know it. Derek stopped directly in front of him. The yard became completely silent. "I have a question," Derek said. Elijah nodded. "Then ask it." Derek crossed his arms. "Who are you really?" Frank held his breath. Several inmates leaned forward. Even Mrs. Brooks stood in the library doorway watching. Elijah looked at the people around him before answering. "I am a man who made mistakes." Derek shook his head. "That is not what I mean." Elijah calmly folded his hands in front of him. "It is the only answer that matters." Derek took one slow step closer. "Everybody keeps acting like you are special." Elijah smiled softly. "Nobody is special. We all have the chance to become better than we were yesterday." The answer only seemed to make Derek more frustrated. He looked down at the cart beside Elijah and picked up one of the donated books. It was old, with a worn leather cover. He held it up for everyone to see. "You hide behind these books because you think they make you look wise." Elijah looked at the book for a moment. Books only remind us that someone else has already learned the lesson we are about to discover. Derek let out a short laugh and handed the book back. "You always talk like that." Elijah accepted the book carefully and placed it back onto the cart. Only when someone is willing to listen. The silence around them grew even deeper. Frank suddenly realized that nobody was paying attention to Derek anymore. Every eye in the yard was focused on the old prisoner. Derek noticed it too. For the first time since he arrived at Blackwood, he was not the center of the moment. His expression hardened. "You think you are better than me?" Elijah slowly shook his head. "No, then what do you think?" Elijah looked directly into his eyes. His voice remained calm, almost kind. "I think you have spent so much time trying to be feared that nobody has given you the chance to be respected." The words seemed to stop the entire yard. Several inmates lowered their heads. Even Frank felt something tighten inside his chest. Nobody had ever spoken to Derek that way. There was no anger, no insult, just quiet honesty. Derek stood perfectly still. For a second it looked as though he might answer. Instead, he turned away and walked back toward his group without saying another word. The crowd slowly began moving again, but the feeling in the yard had changed forever. Frank looked at Elijah and then touched the old newspaper clipping inside his pocket. He finally understood why the old prisoner seemed so familiar. It was not because of a photograph or a forgotten tournament. It was because true masters did not win people over by force. They changed a room simply by the way they carried themselves. And as Derek disappeared into the distance, Frank realized that the biggest revelation was still waiting to be uncovered. The morning after the conversation in the recreation yard, Blackwood State Prison felt quieter than it had in years. Derek Malone still gathered with his group, but the loud laughter and constant boasting had faded. The inmates who once watched him now found themselves looking toward the library, where Elijah Carter quietly arranged returned books beside Mrs. Eleanor Brooks. Nothing about the old prisoner had changed, yet somehow everything around him had. Frank Holloway knew he could not keep the truth to himself any longer. The newspaper clipping and the damaged magazine photograph had become more than old pieces of paper. Together, they formed a story waiting to be completed. During the afternoon library shift, when Mrs. Brooks stepped away to answer a phone call, Frank carefully placed both papers on the table in front of Elijah. The old man looked at them without speaking. His fingers rested gently on the faded photograph. For several long seconds, the library was completely silent. Finally, Frank asked the question that had been growing inside him for days. "Were you that instructor?" Elijah looked through the library window toward the prison yard outside. "A very long time ago. I stood in places that looked nothing like this." Frank leaned forward. "Then it is true." Elijah smiled softly. "Truth is a strange thing. People often spend their whole lives chasing a title when what really matters is what they did with it." Frank looked at the newspaper clipping again. The faded sentence was still visible. The Grandmaster reminded his students that discipline was more important than victory. Frank slowly raised his eyes. "You were a Grandmaster." Elijah remained quiet for a moment before giving a small nod. "I taught Taekwondo for many years." Frank felt his breath catch. The answer was so simple that it almost seemed unreal. "National tournaments?" Elijah nodded once. "Some. Championship teams?" Another quiet nod. Frank looked at the old man sitting across from him. The calm posture, the careful movements, the endless patience. Suddenly, every strange moment since the first day made perfect sense. The falling ball, the books, the tiny screw, the way he had never reacted when Derek tried to humiliate him. It had never been weakness. It had been mastery. Mrs. Brooks returned to the room carrying a stack of donated books. She noticed the old photograph on the table. "That looks familiar," she said. Elijah picked it up and smiled. "It comes from another life." Mrs. Brooks looked at Frank, who was still staring in amazement. "Is everything all right?" Frank answered quietly. "I think I finally understand who he is." Elijah gently folded the photograph and handed it back. "Who I was," he corrected. "The past belongs where people can learn from it, not where they can live inside it." Outside the library window, Derek Malone happened to glance toward the building. He saw Frank holding the old newspaper clipping and noticed the look of disbelief on his face. Curiosity finally overcame his pride. When the afternoon work period ended, he walked over to Frank near the housing block. "What did you find?" Frank looked at him, but said nothing. Derek crossed his arms. "You know something?" Frank slowly reached into his pocket and unfolded the clipping. Derek read the faded headline and frowned. "What is this?" Frank pointed at the old photograph. "That instructor." Derek looked closer, but the image was too damaged to recognize. "What about him?" Frank folded the paper again and looked directly at Derek. "The old man you keep trying to embarrass." Derek laughed. "That teacher." Frank slowly shook his head. "Not just a teacher." He looked back toward the library, where Elijah was helping Mrs. Brooks place books onto the shelves. He spent his life training champions. People traveled across the country just to learn from him. Derek's smile disappeared. "You are serious?" Frank nodded. "I think you have been standing in front of one of the greatest Taekwondo grandmasters this country ever produced." The words seemed to drain the noise from the entire hallway. Derek looked through the library window once more. Elijah was carefully placing a worn history book back onto a shelf, smiling as an elderly inmate thanked him for his help. There was no pride in the old man's face. No desire for attention, just quiet kindness. For the first time since the day he arrived at Blackwood, Derek Malone understood why nothing he had done had ever disturbed the old prisoner. Elijah Carter had already spent a lifetime proving himself to the world, and he no longer needed anyone else's approval. In the days that followed, the story of Elijah Carter spread through Blackwood State Prison without anyone needing to raise their voice. Frank Holloway never told the entire story to everyone he met, but somehow the truth found its own way through the cell blocks and prison yard. The quiet old inmate who spent his afternoons repairing books and helping strangers had once stood before thousands of students as a Taekwondo Grandmaster. Men who had laughed at him during his first day now watched him with quiet respect. The strange thing was that Elijah himself behaved exactly as he always had. He still returned library books on time. He still helped Walter Briggs carry heavy boxes. He still thanked the kitchen workers every time they served a meal. Nothing about him changed because other people finally understood who he was. One afternoon, as the lunch bell echoed through the building, Elijah walked into the cafeteria carrying his tray. The room grew quiet for a moment. It was the same room where soup had once covered his uniform and laughter had filled the air. Now the tables remained silent. Elijah simply nodded to a few familiar faces and walked toward an empty seat near the back wall. Before he could sit down, someone stepped in front of him. It was Derek Malone. Frank looked up from across the room. Walter Briggs stopped eating. Even the correctional officers seemed to notice the tension. Derek stood there for several seconds without speaking. Then, in a voice much quieter than anyone expected, he said, "I owe you an apology." Nobody moved. Elijah looked at the younger man with the same calm expression he had always carried. Derek lowered his eyes for a moment. "I thought respect came from making people fear me." Elijah remained silent. Derek continued, "I spent years believing that if I acted stronger than everyone else, nobody could hurt me." The old prisoner gently placed his tray on the table. "And what do you believe now?" Derek looked around the cafeteria. The people who once followed him so easily were watching and waiting. "I think I was wrong." Elijah nodded slowly. "Real strength is not about proving that you can stand above other people." Derek looked at him. "Then what is it?" Elijah smiled. "Helping them stand beside you." The words settled over the room like complete silence. Frank reached into his pocket and touched the old newspaper clipping one last time. He realized that the greatest lesson Elijah had ever taught had nothing to do with tournaments or championships. It had nothing to do with perfect technique or years of training. The lesson was sitting right in front of them. A man who had once earned the highest respect in his profession had walked into prison carrying no trophies, no titles, and no pride. He had allowed strangers to judge him without fighting back because he understood something they did not. Character never disappears just because the world stops recognizing it. Derek slowly pulled out the chair across from Elijah. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Elijah looked at the empty seat and nodded. "There is always room for one more person." The cafeteria remained quiet as Derek sat down. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. The old story that had begun with humiliation had ended with understanding. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks watched through the doorway and smiled to herself. Walter Briggs shook his head in disbelief. Frank looked across the room at the old Grandmaster and finally understood why the memories had felt so familiar. Great teachers never force people to change. They simply live in a way that inspires others to change themselves. Elijah picked up his spoon and looked at the bowl sitting on the tray. For a brief moment, Frank remembered the first day, the spilled soup, the laughter, and the warning that nobody had understood. "Young man, you still have time to walk away." Now he finally understood what those words had meant. They had never been a threat. They had been an invitation to choose a better path. Elijah quietly folded his napkin, looked around the room one last time, and said, "The strongest people are not the ones who win every fight. They are the ones who never let the world take away their kindness." In that moment, the hardest place inside Blackwood State Prison became completely silent, and for the first time in many years, that silence felt like peace.